Horror. It is one of the most beloved genres. People love to be scared, and horror works in every situation.
Want to watch a film with your friends? Horror. You're going on a date? Horror. You're home alone and want to watch a movie? Horror. Thinking of this, thinking of how big of a genre horror is today, made me wonder what the best horror movie of all time is.
What makes a horror film good? And why are horror films today not as appreciated as older classics?
So I made a list of the best horror movies I've seen and some horror films I've never seen, but heard are among the best. I've also added some of the most popular ones and some newer horror films. Some of these films might be on the grasp of being horror and some are wholeheartedly horror, but they've all been on some list amongst the greats from what I've seen.
As you see, I've chosen 35 films, and I'll go through 5 each episode.
This series will be split into 6 videos, unless movies are added during the process, and hopefully I can find the ultimate horror film. If you think I missed a film you'd like to see on that list, then leave a comment below. By the end of this series I hope to have a top 5, bottom 5 and some honorable mentions, and maybe finally I can pinpoint what makes horror films great.
So, for this first episode, I'll take a look at Bird Box, Julia's Eyes, It Follows, Veronica and Psycho. First up, Bird Box.
So, Bird Box is a film directed by Susan Bier. It follows Sandra Bullock's character Mallory before and after the outbreak from some kind of monster that makes you want to kill yourself. Doesn't this just write the reviews by themselves? Why I chose to have this one on the list is because it's been heavily talked about the last few weeks. I've seen many good reviews and many bad.
So, what did I think?
How can a public, who's generally caught up to speed in pop culture, not realize when they're being fed a complete rehash of stuff they've seen a million times and love it? Like, fucking love it.
Firstly, I wasn't very scared by this movie. Most of the suicide scenes were a bit tame, the psychopaths who welcomed the monsters weren't very good either, but that was probably because of the poor acting.
I didn't find the setting unsettling, and the score didn't help.
The premise of not being able to see anything is not bad. If done right, it can be very scary, like in Julia's Eyes, as I'll explain later. But in Bird Box, when the characters try to coordinate without sights, it's more comical than scary.
Not to mention that many of the shots are filmed with the blindfold, which just makes it even less scary.
The only thing I found a little bit unsettling was in the beginning, when a medical patient hit her head against a glass window multiple times. Oh, also, John Malkovich's acting was incredibly disturbing. Just as the scares, the story was weak.
It felt uninspired and unoriginal.
If you've seen Can't Breathe or Hush, you can easily see some similarities. I'm not saying Bird Box is a copy of these films, but when they come out so close to each other, it's hard not to see similarities and feel that it's a rehash of earlier ones. Despite having the same premise, the overall story is a bit different to them, but in the grand scheme of things, it's still quite unoriginal. Basically, the film follows Mallory right after the outbreak in one storyline, and Mallory with her 2 kids, boy and girl, in another. So we'll break down both. In the storyline after the outbreak, Mallory hides in a house with some other uninteresting characters.
And it's basically an episode from The Walking Dead Season 2. All they do is argue about different things.
Who should do this? Should we let this guy be a part of the group? You got my wife killed, and so on and so forth. Very uninteresting and very repetitive. The second storyline of Mallory and her kids is them trying not to die while floating down the river to get to some garden with blind people. Not much is happening except, this I guess? Oh, and also, the plot twist that girl was Olympia's daughter was utter garbage. Shallow and uninteresting.
Not much more to say, honestly.
The monster or monsters weren't very well portrayed. Apparently, they can't go into houses for some reason. And apparently, birds can detect them sometimes?
They're not very well explained.
All that is said is that they're some kind of demon or something. And that's said by Charlie, and he's an idiot. Who the fuck will read your book when everyone's dead? All this considered, I give this film a 3 out of 10. Very average in some parts, shit in some other parts, and mostly bad. Julia's Eyes is a Spanish film produced by Guillermo del Toro
and directed by Guillermo Morales.
It came out 2010, and the story is quite intriguing, especially in comparison to Bird Box. The story is about Julia, who believes her blind twin sister Sarah actually was murdered and didn't hang herself as everyone else is saying. On her mission to find her sister's murderer, her own sight starts to slowly get worse.
She is starting to lose her sight.
When researching her sister's last days alive, she finds out about a mysterious lover and she finds herself being watched by a mysterious man. Unlike Bird Box, this movie was a lot more unsettling.
The premise of not being able to see is a lot better executed than in Bird Box.
Instead of having shots where the audience is completely blind to the action, Julia's Eyes is filmed in a way that highlights the mystery and the paranoia that Julia goes through.
A big chunk of this movie is filmed in a way so the audience can feel exactly what Julia is feeling.
At some point, the audience can't even see the other characters' faces, just like Julia. The director is very creative in how to make the audience feel, how to make them on edge. Again, unlike Bird Box, this film didn't follow a trend. This film came out a few years before every horror movie took away a human sense from its main characters. But if you haven't seen this film yet, do not worry. Even though you might be tired of this premise,
Julia's Eyes does it right.
This story works perfectly with the premise, because as our main character gets closer to her goal, her sight only gets worse, which ups the stakes.
You're always on edge.
In comparison to Bird Box, the characters serve the story better, and you feel what purpose they have in relation to Julia and her character arc. Once again, Julia's Eyes excel where Bird Box failed. Throughout the film we see a presence, and in some scenes we even see the figure of a man in the background watching Julia. But we never see his face, which is not only smart for a horror film to begin with, but smart for this character. Because the man following Julia, this stalker, is a man so average and so dull that no one ever remembers his face after he leaves a room.
He's practically invisible.
The idea of having a character so plain that is invisible and unforgettable makes the threat of him so much more disturbing. He could be watching you anytime and you wouldn't know it, or you wouldn't remember it. At least I found him extremely appalling.
If you've seen this movie, tell me in the comments below what you think.
Overall, I liked this film and I give it a 6 out of 10. While I've been positive mostly, I did find it a bit slow at times and wasn't very interested in anyone else but the main character and the villain.
Okay, so It Follows is a film from 2014.
Directed by David Robert Mitchell.
I didn't know much about this film going in, and sadly I was a bit disappointed.
It started out well, but as the movie went on, it just got worse and worse. So what is It Follows about? In It Follows we follow the young woman Jay. After having sex with her boyfriend Hugh, he tells her he's passed on some kind of curse where this entity will follow her until she passes it on to someone else by sexual intercourse. This entity can only walk, and if Jay is touched by it, she will die. So, while the premise is original, it got quite old quite fast. In the beginning it was a bit unsettling to see this monster, or whatever you could call it, slowly get closer and closer to Jay. The director did a good job to create this feeling of paranoia. There are some shots when you can see the monster slowly get close to Jay without the film beating you over the head. This is good because you as a viewer will be alert at all times in suspicion of where the monster might be. On the other hand, this got a bit repetitive after a few scenes.
For me, after seeing the monster walk over and over again, it just started to look goofy.
Like the only thing the kids had to do was walking at a slowly higher pace than the monster. Would it not have been better if we never got to see the monster? As an audience, we would see it as the other kids. We would see how scared Jay was, but we wouldn't exclude the fact that Hugh might have just played a trick on her that made her slowly go paranoid that she actually went crazy in the end. Myself, I would have preferred that. Despite this, the overall makeup effects of the monster with the help from the score works well, but as I said before,
after a while you just get used to it, and in terms of scares, the movie didn't have much else to offer.
I know it's kind of a trope that the story of horror films are quite weak, but that doesn't excuse it. It would have been nice with a better story, because as it is, you just follow these kids running around back and forth.
It felt like a cheesy horror film in a lot of ways.
Also, this might not be a dig on the story, but I felt the setting was a bit all over the place. In one way they're going for that nostalgic 70s 80s tone, but at the same time they have modern things such as this cell phone thingy. I'm not sure what the intent was behind this, but I just found it distracting. Back to the story, it was very predictable. Right from the beginning you know that this Paul guy would sacrifice himself in the end. You knew that Greg would die and you knew Paul would fucking shoot someone with that gun. Speaking of that, whatever was the Jara character about? She talks like once, but I guess she had to be there to get shot? Ridiculous. Also, I'm not sure if the monster is supposed to be a metaphor for STDs or something. If that was the intention, I guess that's a nice idea, but that's not really something that either makes the movie better or worse.
Oh, and why didn't Jay and her friends drive as far as possible away from the monster?
Like move to China or Australia and live happily ever after. As I mentioned before, I didn't hate the monster.
I mostly had some problems with how it was portrayed.
But one thing that did bug me throughout the film, and it did get worse as the movie went on, was the inconsistencies of the monster. It is clearly stated in the beginning that this entity will follow Jake, walking slowly towards her, until she sleeps with someone else, and if it touches her, she will die. But just like the zombies in The Walking Dead, it is really inconsistent. At one point it moves really fast, and another it's moving super slow. At one point it can charge its victims, and at another it's just walking slowly. With its first two victims in the film, it's implied the one being chased dies as soon as the monster touches them. But Jay has been touched multiple times by this monster at the end. Also, the monster is supposed to be really smart, so why the fuck is it chilling on that roof? It's just so dumb. I give this film a 4 out of 10.
Veronica is another Spanish film.
The film takes place in Madrid, 1991, where a girl finds herself possessed by some supernatural demon after she played Ouija with two classmates. I remember some months ago this film gained quite a lot of traction. The advertisement for this film was that people with a weak heart and so on should not watch it, and someone had even died from it from how scary it was. So did it live up to that? No. I mean, it was pretty good, but not great. I felt that it relied more on jump scares and disturbing imagery rather than having a tone that just makes you uncomfortable. And maybe that's just my personal taste, but I prefer the latter.
But there were some scenes that were good.
Everything with the blind old lady I found really well done, especially from a cinematic standpoint. It looked great. The dream sequences was done well too, even if they relied more on a what the fuck feeling, but I guess that's a feat in itself. I especially liked the one where her little sisters started to eat her. Very weird, but it worked for the overall tone.
Though, I did find anything that had to do with the Ouija board ridiculous.
Maybe it's because it was a huge meme some years ago that I just couldn't take it serious. Perhaps people who are really into Ouija boards and that shit found those parts interesting or scary, but I couldn't keep myself from thinking back to those fake and silly Ouija videos. So overall the film was a bit unpleasant, but nothing that stuck with you in my opinion. I would have preferred another way to go about it. I said before that It Follows would have been better if you never saw the monster. In Veronica you never really see the monster either, and I think that helps it a lot. It does make you question if there's really a monster or if there's something wrong with Veronica. Just as the other characters questions her, we as an audience do as well. So, the scares and the overall tone was decent, but the overall story was quite lame.
There was nothing new or original about it.
I mean, how many horror films have we seen where the story revolves around a family and one of the family members gets possessed or something by that nature? While I didn't find it quite as predictable as It Follows, it was very conventional, and as the film went on, it felt more like it checked off some boxes instead of trying to surprise the audience in any way. As expected, the mom is not really believing her, as well as her friends who also is freezing her out, while her sisters and her brother are in the biggest danger from the demon. It feels like I've seen this in so many horror films before, and I couldn't get invested in the movie at all. The characters were uninteresting and flat.
They didn't bring anything special to the film, neither in actions nor in personality.
You could have replaced them with anyone, I guess the only thing that was mildly interesting was the metaphor for puberty. Veronica getting possessed by this demon was, I think, a metaphor for her anxiety of going through puberty, but this have already been made much better in Carrie.
So, once again, this film doesn't bring anything new to the table.
Last but not least, we have the monster. Again, it's been seen before. Demon possesses child of a family. Very scary, but this trope has been done to death that it has to be done in a new way for it to feel slightly original or interesting.
The idea of the nightmares were interesting, or better phrased, could have been interesting.
If there was a bigger focus on that instead of the Ouija board shit, maybe this film would have had a stronger hook. But, as it is, it didn't. Shame. All in all, I think this film suffered from its fixation of being trendy. Ouija boards are popular and very trendy. I've seen them in other films as well. Like I said before, maybe this is a pet peeve of mine, but in my opinion, the Ouija board isn't a great hook. The nightmare sequences and her anxiety were better, even if it had been done before. If they would have put more time and thought into it, then maybe this film would have been more memorable. As it is, I give it a 5 out of 10.
Psycho is a horror film from 1960 directed by the legend Alfred Hitchcock.
The story follows a young woman who checks in at a motel run by a man and his dominant mother. As you probably already know, Psycho is a classic and not only regarded as one of the best horror films ever made, but one of the best films ever made.
So, do I love this movie as much as everyone else?
I'm not going to beat around the bush. I really like this film.
Sure, some things have not aged well, but if you take into account the circumstances this film was made in, it is really impressive how haunting it is.
Since Psycho couldn't show as much as in other movies I mentioned, it had to rely more on setting than jump scares or gruesome visuals. The music together with the camera work and the magnificent performance from Anthony Perkins work so well together. The whole dialogue between Norman Bates and Marion Crane is so unsettling. Even though you don't know what's wrong, you can just feel that there's something malicious about Norman. And you don't really see the twist coming. Or at least I didn't, which is surprising because I saw this film just a few years ago. And the twist really adds to the story and the character of Norman. With all this said, I wouldn't say this film is the scariest film I've ever seen. Sure, I can appreciate it for what it is, but like I said before, this film is in some aspects a bit out of date, which makes it less horrific and scary in my opinion. The story works pretty good overall. It's a good fit for the characters and the monsters, so to say. I like how it plays out. It's probably not as deep as something as It Comes at Night, but it's simple and clever enough to make it suspenseful, which 3 of the films I've talked about so far fail with. I love that the film is a bit of the slower kind, because I tend to prefer those. It takes its time to explain everything. We get to know our characters, and all in all, it never feels rushed. And the most important thing for a horror film in my opinion, even though it takes all this time to build up to the twist in the end, it keeps things mysterious. We never get to know too much about Norman and his mother. Well, I guess until the absolute end, but more on that later. From beginning to the climax, you never really see the mother, which gets your thoughts going. In a film, whatever you can fantasize is worse than a film can show you. That's why I leave unimpressed by a lot of horror films, because in my thoughts, I have a vision for the monster being so much scarier looking than what it usually ends up being. Mystery keeps up the suspense, and Psycho sure is suspenseful. The only criticism I have really is the long and boring exposition in the end.
Like I said before, I prefer when films show rather than tell.
And Psycho sure does shove in your face what has happened in the film at the end. I've already said a lot about Norman Bates and his mother. The way it's presented, how Norman talks about himself and his mother.
It's just brilliant.
In comparison to other films, Psycho is very good at knowing what to show the audience and what to not show the audience. The character of Norman is beautifully portrayed, and I don't know what more to say without rehashing what I've already said. This film doesn't work with another character. Without Norman Bates or some slight changes to him, this film would for sure be a lot different. All in all, this of course is a classic and a horror film I would recommend to anyone. Even though it's old, it holds up in so many ways. I give this film an 8 out of 10.
So, that was it for this episode. I'm not sure when the next episode will come out, but like I said before, if you have any suggestions for films you want added to my list, just write them in the comment section below or hit me up on Twitter.
I'll have a pinned tweet where anyone can suggest horror films I should review for this series.
Hopefully you enjoyed the first episode of this series, and if you did, don't forget to like and subscribe. And until next episode, be safe.